Matthew chapter 6 is probably most popular because it's where the disciples turned to Jesus and said, Jesus, teach us how to pray. And that's when Jesus began to teach them how to pray. But what sparked that conversation, what sparked that question of Lord, teach us how to pray by the disciples is what Jesus began teaching before that. And Jesus began teaching before that how not to pray. In fact, he said, beginning in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 5, this is what he said. He says, and when you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you that they have their reward in full. Now, a couple of things right here. Their interest is to be seen by men. And Jesus said when they do that, they have their reward in full. And what is their reward in full? Their reward in full is a pat on the back by man. Good job. You're a righteous man of God. You're a righteous woman of God. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in a pat on the back by men and accolades of men. I'm interested in giving God honor and glory. And so he said, don't go out there in the synagogues or your churches and, stand up and present yourself in such a self-righteous way. Don't stand out there on the street corners to where everybody can see you. Jesus isn't teaching right here that there's something wrong about praying in public when you're giving God the glory and you're humble before God and you're pointing people to Jesus and your heart is directed towards God and not interested in what man's thinking, then there's nothing wrong with that. But when you're trying to draw attention to yourself, Jesus said that is wrong. He called them hypocrites right here. And so that certainly is a hypocritical action. And so Jesus goes on to say in verse 7, he says, and when you are praying. Now twice he said, when you're praying. So in other words, Jesus wants us to pray, right? And that is expected of every Christian. And so in verse 7 he says, and when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetition as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. And so don't just use this meaningless repetition that Jesus is saying. Don't just be wordy for the sake of being wordy and say all of these repetitive things over and over and over again. Jesus said don't do that. And so, we even take what many call the Lord's Prayer. I call it the example prayer that comes right after this, and they just quote it. And say, well, that's praying. Well, that's not praying. Praying is having a conversation with God. That's what praying is. So just quoting things and just repeating things over and over and over and over again. Jesus said don't do that. But we come to him with a heart to commune with him, with a heart to spend time with him, with a heart that's broken over the needs of others, with a heart that's broken over our own failures and shortcomings, and coming to him by faith that only he can supply all of our needs according to his riches and glory. So don't be like the hypocrites, Jesus said. And don't stand on the street corners drawing attention to yourself. And don't just say repetitive things that are meaningless and have no value. Come to commune with God. Come to spend quality time with God. Because you're standing in need, because your church, your family, community, your nation, your world is standing in need. Jesus went on to tell them, he said, in verse 8, he said, so do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. So what's then even the point of praying if God already knows what we need? Because it's communion with God. It's an act of faith and obedience, but it's spending quality time with your Father who is in heaven.